and Dr. Richard Schneider with Nature Alberta began his career as a veterinarian in Saskatchewan, but quickly transitioned to wildlife research, obtaining a PhD from the University of Guelph. Richard's main interest has been conservation biology, working at the interface between science and policy. Early on, he worked for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and then as an ecological consultant, and finally as a senior scientist at the Integrated Landscape Management Lab at the U of A. He's authored 2 books on biodiversity conservation and numerous scientific articles with over 1,200 citations. He has recently retired, but continues to serve as the editor-in-chief of Nature Alberta magazine. Please welcome Dr. Richard Schneider.
Good here. I think I am. Thank you very much. Am I good? So I expect that most of you here or a large part are interested or focused on the human impacts of climate change. But my presentation here, I'm going to today look at, let's call it broader context. What's going to happen in terms of major ecosystem types across the prairies as the climate warms. So we have across the prairies 4 main ecosystems: the boreal forest, the parkland and grasslands and Rockies. And in this map, we see their distribution across the prairies. Now, of course, in the bottom, if I do this, yeah, there we go. Grasslands in the south, most of the north is boreal forest, and then there's this transition zone referred to as parkland between the grassland and boreal forest. Out west, the Rockies, and up in the far north, a bit of more open taiga. So I've only got about 20 minutes with you today, so this hour talk you're getting in a condensed version. I won't speak faster, but I can't talk about all of the variations and nuances. We're going to focus on one specific transition, and that's between grassland and boreal forest. My sense is that will have the greatest relevance or importance across the prairies, for at least for most people. So if you get in your car, let's say in Regina, and you start to drive north to Prince Albert, you'll start out obviously in an open prairie, short grass ecosystem, drought tolerant. And as you move farther north, the grasses start to get a little bit taller, and you start to see clumps of aspen. And then as you reach this transitional zone, this transitional zone here, the parkland, that's, I think of it as the tipping point between grassland and forest. And that'll become quite important later when we start talking about transitions. But once you get to there, it's a roughly equal balance between grass and aspen, this mixture. A little bit farther yet, and we get into a kind of a dry mixed wood, it's called, mainly a closed aspen forest. And then finally, in the boreal forest proper, it's a mixture of aspen and coniferous trees, mainly spruce and pine. So we're going to talk here about what does the future hold as far as these ecosystem distributions under a warming climate. But the first step, if we're going to try to predict the future, is to understand the cause of the existing distributions. We have to understand that first before we can project that through time. And so in the prairies, and this is really different wherever you are in the world, what I'm going to talk about here today doesn't apply to, let's say, Ontario or Quebec or BC or whatever. I'm going to speak, everything I speak about today will be specific to the prairies. And so for us, water is the most important factor driving the distributions that we see. Simply put, it takes a lot more water to grow a tree than it does a clump of grass. Precipitation is a driving factor, but as you might expect, there are nuances that we have to take into account. It's more than just precipitation. As you heard from Dr. Morrison this morning, it's a little bit of a mixed bag for what the future holds in terms of precipitation. Quite variable, but certainly we're not going to see loads of increased precipitation. If anything, we're trending down or staying the same. So in terms of the ecosystem, though, there's more to it than just the amount of precipitation. My work's all been done in Alberta, so some of my maps here will be focused on that. And here I'm showing you the annual precipitation for Alberta, the norms, if you will, over the past. Now down in the south, you can see that, yeah, sure enough, there's fairly low rates of precipitation down in the south where the grasslands are. But wait a minute, when you go up to the top here at the NWT border, actually the same amount of precipitation. So wait a minute, we have grasslands and open prairie in the south and the closed boreal forest at the top. It's obviously more going on, even at a finer level. If you look at a city like Calgary around here, Fort McMurray up here, roughly the same amount of annual precipitation, yet Calgary's in an open prairie landscape and Fort McMurray's in the middle of smack in the middle of boreal forest. So the answer is it's the ground moisture that's what's important, not just what falls from the sky. And to understand ground moisture, you have to take into account evaporation. So down in the south here, we've got a certain amount of rain falling, but certainly in late summers, those hot days, it's driving the moisture out of the ground and it's drying out. So ground moisture, what the plants and the animals for that matter have to work with, is much reduced relative to up here where similar amounts of precipitation, but it's staying there. It's available. And that fundamentally is what's driving these large scale patterns that we're seeing. Now, what I'm showing here is sort of a microcosm for the big scale information I just gave you. This is a small tributary of the Battle River in central Alberta. And what you're seeing here is a site with obviously the same amount of precipitation across the entire site that you're looking at here, but quite varied vegetation patterns. Now at the bottom, seem to have lost my pointer. At the bottom of the valley, we're getting some runoff from the sides. And so there's quite a bit of moisture down there, enough to support a very quite vigorous spruce forest there. But when you look at this bank here, this is facing straight south. So it's getting all the direct sunlight during the days, a lot of evaporation there. In fact, just enough to maintain a short drought resistant type of grassland vegetation. There's even cactus and scattered sage in this area here. On the other bank, exactly the same amount of precipitation and runoff, and yet we're seeing aspen and a few spruce in there. That's the north-facing bank. It's not getting that level of evaporation, and so it is able to maintain a different type of vegetation. So, in summary, basically, if you know the local climate, you can predict what's going to grow there. Tell me, the climate, I'll tell you what's there, at least within the prairies. That then can be used to predict future distributions. By knowing future climates, we can start to predict what the future vegetation is going to look like. Now, the foundation for the modeling I did a fair bit of bioclimatic envelope modeling, machine learning and such, and produced maps that push this all push this through time. But I'm not going to show you any of that today because you don't really need it. I can convey the main points to you just with simple visual pattern matching. In the next few slides, I'm going to do that. The foundation of it all, though, is temperature. As I said, temperature is driving what happens with precipitation. There is likely to be some precipitation change. It's not clear what it'll be, but certainly not going up. So the key variable here, though, is temperature and what that does in terms of causing higher evaporation. So let's take a look at what we're potentially dealing with. On the left is the current distribution of climate zones or temperature zones here. And what I show you is two options for the future. We don't know what the future holds. What we know with certainty, with absolute certainty, that there's a minimum case. There's already a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. It hasn't all worked its way through the climate, but in terms of weather patterns and such, but we know there's at least 2 degrees of warming baked into the system today. So this I would call the best case scenario. If we really get our act together in terms of climate mitigation, this is the future that we're looking at. If we massively screw up and don't do anything, hard to say how much it will be, but the models for the Alberta as a province show it could be upwards towards 6 degrees of warming. Now, what does that mean? And we'll just look at some comparisons here. If you look at some of the color here, this dark red at the US border, where does that go in terms of spatially when you increase the temperature to 2 degrees? Well, here it is mid-province. Obviously everything else shifts up. What about the southern parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba for that matter? Well, if you start to see, these colors here, well, you have to go to southern Montana and South Dakota to start seeing equivalent temperatures today. Now, if we look at the future in terms of the worst case scenario, the changes are truly profound. Again, here's Lethbridge and Medicine Hat, those temperatures, and remember, this is open, dry prairie in Medicine Hat and Lethbridge. This is where it is. That's where that temperature band ends up. Northwest Territories boundary. That's the worst case. What about southern Alberta? Now you've got to go to the hottest parts of Idaho and Wyoming. It's not big desert here, but this is way, way different than what it is today. So let's look at some of the ecological implications. And again, I'm not going to present you a whole bunch of modeling results. They tell you the same story. I'll give you a reference for where you can find it if you're interested. But we're just going to do some simple pattern matching. If the climate increases by 2 degrees, where do you find a 2-degree warmer climate today? Oh yeah, it's in Montana. So we can go there and we can say, oh yeah, this is the kind of vegetation that grows there. And, in terms of what it looks like, it's a grassland. Yes, some of these species are going to be different. The mixture is not the same, but it's still grass. So under a best case scenario, in terms of ecosystems, southern Alberta will change in terms of the species mix of grassland, but still grassland. If we go towards more of the higher and higher temperatures, the worst case scenario, we're having to go farther and farther south into drier parts of the US. And here we're looking at a sagebrush steppe type of vegetation, and not a desert. But if you are a potato farmer or something, this is a pretty bad news. It's a huge amount of change. The other important thing to think about for the southern prairies is these potholes. Again, I'm talking from an ecological perspective, and these wet areas, you probably heard of this being the duck factory for North America, and it really is. These are very important ecologically, these small wetlands. What happens when you increase the temperature? You've heard some of it through Dr. Morrison's talk earlier. Earlier snow melts, spring's coming earlier. You've got a longer period of evaporation. You've got higher temperatures driving the rate of evaporation. So these potholes, even though they'll fill up in the early spring, they won't last as long, and the depth won't be as great as they are today. So you're seeing shrinking from what they are today, and that applies to lakes as well. So there are a lot of these ripple effects that we can expect, and the amount depends on how warm it gets. What about the boreal forest? Well, I mentioned how the parkland, this color in brown here, is a transitional point. I call it, it's sort of a tipping point. It's just about enough water to grow a forest, but not quite. And so today well, here we are. Edmonton sits in the parkland region. I mean, a lot of it's going to be converted to farmland, of course, but this is where we are. So if we go to the future, oh yeah, I have some photos here of just what this looks like in terms of the different ecosystems. This is a parkland, a natural, there aren't many of these left to be honest, but this is what a natural parkland habitat looks like, a mixture of spruce and brush in open prairie. This is the little bit farther north and you get into dry mixed wood. It's a closed aspen forest. So that's what that looks like. And then finally, when you're in the boreal forest proper, it's a mixture of aspen and coniferous species. So what happens if we raise the temperature by a couple of degrees? Well, you can think of it as just like moving up the ladder. All of these ecosystems will shift essentially one step over. And we've actually seen this happen before. It's in the paleological record. Scientists have dug cores into the bottom of lakes going back several thousand years, and you find that 6,000 years ago, there was a rise of about 3 degrees in temperature. And ecosystems in Alberta and across the prairies shifted north in the way I'm describing here. So we actually have seen that experiment run at least once. So the parkland here, today it's at a tipping point, but you increase the temperature by a couple of degrees, it now has the climate of a grassland habitat. So it starts to look like grassland over time. I'll talk about that in a minute. Same goes for the dry mixed wood. That's this color of green here. I'm not sure if that's coming through for you, but this solid or closed aspen forest, it already exists in Alberta along the Peace Country here. It's sort of unique. In fact, you even got some prairie. I mean, this is where the city of Grand Prairie, and they didn't misname that. It really is a prairie up there. And so what happens is all of this dry mixed wood now becomes parkland. And again, over time, the nature of that forest will start to follow its climate and carries on through the rest. Here we have boreal forest, but with a 2-degree change, that full boreal becomes more like a dry mixed wood. So you're losing spruce over time is what's essentially happening. The only parts that really stay are these polygons here. These are hills. These are hills, so they're elevated and so they're cooler. And so they will remain as boreal forest under a 2-degree warming scenario for sure. And you can ask me what happens under the worst case. It's hard to be sure. Everything that I've said here will happen, but it'll keep on going. And so at some point you could conceivably end up with the entire north transitioning to grassland with only the hills remaining as a forested type of habitat. It really will all depend on the amount of warming. So if people sometimes have the idea that global warming is binary, it happens or it doesn't happen, you should take that thought away and replace it with a linear change. The more warm it gets, the warmer it gets, the more transition we'll see. And this amount of transition is you can't understate that. This is one of the biggest transitions in Canada. You go to Ontario, Quebec, you heat it up, well, they're very wet. So you'll get a more productive forest, a more diverse forest. With us, it's going to be too dry and you're going to lose forest. So the change is really something that you don't want to see. So how long does it take? What I'm speaking about is the equilibrium state, or where it ends up over time. So, if I can just go back here, if this area here has the climate of Lethbridge, it's going to look like Lethbridge. You don't need a model to tell you that. You just can't support a forest with a climate like Lethbridge. But it doesn't happen very quickly. It turns out that a mature tree of any kind, but conifers, here we're talking about white spruce, they're quite resilient. If you've traveled around the prairies, you'll see all the farmyards with ring of spruce around there. It's way outside their normal habitat. Why do they exist? It's because someone has planted and tended them when they're little. It's when they're little that they're very vulnerable. Okay, so climate hasn't changed enough yet to do much here, but there will become a point where it's not suitable for spruce anymore, but the old trees, they'll carry on. It's only after a disturbance happens and the existing trees are killed. And in boreal, it's mostly fire that does that. So once fire comes in, wipes out the mature trees, you'll see that the young seedlings will struggle to regenerate. And so the transition will take a long time. We're talking decades. People in this room will not see, even under the worst case, a grassland in the northern Alberta or elsewhere. It's going to take many, many, many decades. It'll start in patches. First of all, the temperature has to go up higher than it has today. And after that happens, it's only going to be after disturbance that in patches, things start to change. So those big fires that happened last year, they're all going to regenerate to forest, or most of them. But at some point, they're not, right? And cumulatively, over time, you're going to see this transition happen. Okay, so now I'm going to change gears. I've kind of given you just a taste time we have for the kinds of ecological transitions that we're looking at. Some of them aren't too big. Best case scenario in the prairies, yeah, we got different grass. Worst case in the boreal, boy, that is a profound change. But we have to ask this question: so what? We're going to get warmer. So what? there's a difference. If we can think of it as a thought experiment. If all we're doing is warming things up, aren't we just pushing all of the ecosystems straight north? And if that's the case, is it true that a change is the same as loss? I think it's a fair question. And we know that because all of our species, every last species in Canada is a survivor of the ice age. You know, there's no species in Alberta that withstood the ice. They all got pushed into the States. So they have the capacity to move. If they didn't, they wouldn't be here today because they went to the States and they came back again. However, caveats, of course, it depends on the species. The example I'm showing here is a white-tailed deer, and we're seeing over the last couple of decades, they are moving north steadily. There have been reports up as high as the NWT border. And that didn't happen in the past because the severe winters would keep them from going that far north. Now they're starting to go there. It's a very adaptable species. So warming is actually quite a positive thing if you're a white-tailed deer, but that's not a blanket statement. Other species, I'm showing here burrowing owls, they have been hammered by the effects of human, mostly agriculture. And so their populations are a small fraction of what they once were. And they are just struggling to survive. They do not have much resilience. They cannot withstand one more source of pressure on them, especially, I think you heard about the variability that's going to happen. That combination of existing impacts and climate together will be enough to push, I think, quite a few species over the brink. The other big difference is that, let's say the time of glaciation, species could move wherever they wanted. It was all open. Today, there are barriers to movement. You've got things like canola fields, you've got roads, you've got towns. So the rate of movement is going to be slower than it was. It's going to be harder for species to move where they need to go as the climate gets warmer. And worth also pointing out that this episode of climate change is quite a bit faster than those past episodes that the species lived through. So depending on your ability to move, it could be quite hard to keep up. I think that's a key theme here. It's the rate of change that's important. If this happens over 200 or 300 years, you know, most species will make it. You think about grassland species, you know, the burrowing owl, that's a grassland. 75% of our species at risk are grassland species. So if we open up the grasslands and move them north, hey, we've got a good situation for grassland species. But if it happens in 30 or 50 years, boy, that's a different story. That becomes really hard. And that's a point. I don't have time to really talk about adaptation, but when you get into conservation, buying time and helping species keep up with the pace of change are critical things. So just to sum up, temperatures we're going to get warmer. The key for us in the prairies, and again, just to be clear, this is very localized to the prairies. It's all about water and evaporation and what remains in the ground for plants to use. We're going to see the southern prairies are getting drier and the grasslands are going to shift northwards. I also want to, again, reiterate that this is not going to happen quickly. Many decades into the next century for sure. And again, it's not binary. The amount of change will really depend on the amount of warming that occurs. And so, I mean, you all know this, but to me, that's the biggest thing. We've got to somehow keep it to, 2 to 3 degrees. We can deal with that. The animals, not all of them, but most of them, they're going to come along for the ride. We push it to 4 or 5 degrees, it becomes hard to adapt to that level of change. And it really saddens me that it's become so political that we can't have the conversation. We can talk about it here and I go out on the street and I talk to somebody and, I get a hand and they think I'm crazy. And it's just, it really kills me. Lastly, it's not the same for everybody. Certainly some species are adaptable and they're going to do just fine, white-tailed deer. Others are going to struggle. The last slide, this is outside of my area of experience, so take this as wild speculation, but based on what I've seen here, it seems clear to me that the rural population is going to be affected most. We're looking at major changes in agriculture, in forestry. Again, not quickly, decades away, but big differences to the way that people make a living. And at the same time, we've got the decline in oil and gas as we shift to renewables. So a huge change for anybody out on the land today. Urban population really hard to my mind. I see a mixed bag. You know, you ask the question, you know, why does the United States have 10 times the population that Canada does? Well, one of the big reasons is it's damn cold here. And, you know, as it gets warmer, or, you know, I've just read the other day that migration patterns in the States, northern states are moving to the south. So as it gets warmer here, is the climate perfect? No, but on the whole, yeah, it's probably a better climate than what we've had. Is it all good? Of course not, though. This adaptation that we're all talking about here, it costs money. It costs a lot of money. Our whole infrastructure is geared around a certain climate. To adapt to something new is going to cost money. I'll give you one example is in water. We're going to lose the glacier water. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to build big reservoirs. We're not going to die of thirst. They're already on the books, and Alberta's got several reservoirs they're building. How much do they cost? Billions of dollars. Who's going to pay for that? You are. All of us as taxpayers are, and most of the people live in town, so we're going to pay that. And that comes out of your disposable income and what cities and towns, you know, can do with the money they have. Goods likely to be higher in cost, and you know, the disruptions in the economy possibly. So I look at it as a mixed bag, and you know, hopefully you folks will figure out all those details. Just to end off, if any of you are interested in that ecological side, I mean, that's the only thing I really have focused on myself. There's a lot more in this book. I've got a link there, a whole chapter on climate change and everything I said today in greater detail. So I offer that to you. And with that, I'm happy to address any questions that anyone may have.
Check mic, check.
Okay. Let's take a few questions for Dr. Schneider. So either at the mic or on the Mentimeter. So go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I've had the privilege, I guess, of working in reclamation and also with revegetation across pretty much all of Alberta and BC, none of it, everywhere. My question is, reclamation and revegetation practices currently focus on the now for planting, but should policy and practices really start focusing on the then, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think some are looking at that. I know the what do you call that? The penetration of these ideas takes time, and it's not everywhere. But certainly, we are just having conversation before at the break about what trees are we supposed to plant. You know, as we go and reforest after every clear cut. You know, in BC, they're working very hard at moving from like up the ladder, if you will, from one site to another. And, you know, I was told is Alberta's watching it very carefully and going to do it as well. I would think the same applies to wherever you talk about reclamation, but everything's complicated, right? Do you go try to predict what's going to happen, or you say, look, those southern species, they have genetic adaptations that we don't want to lose. So what do we do with them? We don't want to just forget about that stuff and plant the new stuff. It's a thought process to have to go through of how to manage the genetic adaptations that are out there without losing anything at the same time moving forward. So yes, for sure we have to, I think for sure we have to do it. Is it hard to do? Yeah, it's really hard to do.
Thank you. Let's take one of the questions from the Mentimeter. So this one's about artificially wetting forests. So is it possible to manage dryness by artificially wetting the forest by storing a large amounts of snow during the winter in very massive containers and releasing it in the warmer months? So an adaptation.
I don't have any, direct experience here, but at the scales that you saw me talking about, it's tens of thousands of square kilometers. I can't see that practical. Another example, it's along these lines is why don't we do assisted migration of species? Like I gave you the burrowing owl. Why don't we just catch some of them and put them in the north? And there have been some trials of plants, the blazing star, where we put them, a couple hundred kilometers to the north and seeing how are they going to do. I think there's potential to do that. What I wonder is who's going to pay for it? Because we don't look at the job we're doing today at wildlife management. It's pitiful, right? There's really, and if it's not shot or fished, it's a few dollars. And who's going to pay millions of dollars to artificially, help migration of these species? That's what I think the problem is. We're not going to pay for it. The possibility is there, but reality is probably not there.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I come from City of Saskatoon, and I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that buying time. Is that all on mitigation, or are there some key roles, especially in urban areas, that we can play on the buying time through other measures?
My whole experience is all outside of the city. So I'm not going to satisfy your answer, but I can tell you that, again, we were just chatting about it before the break. If we can slow down the transition of the forests, moving from what it is today to a grassland, we allow animals more time to migrate. As an example is caribou. Some people I've heard say, well, look, they're toast. No way that caribou is going to survive in Alberta in this warmer time. And it's true. At the middle to high end, there's no way there's going to be a caribou left in Alberta. Why are we spending millions of dollars trying to save them? Let them go. Well, my perspective is that that's a pretty shallow or short-sighted approach. Isn't our job as wildlife managers to help them do what they need to do to survive over the long term? And that means helping them move. And what that means is maintaining forest for as long as possible to give them time to shift. So it may be that forestry companies who are required to replant after they cut are actually going to be the heroes of the story here, where if we left it all alone and fire burned it and it didn't regenerate, change could come fairly quickly. But if we go and grow these little seedlings in a nursery and plant them at massive scale as we do today, maybe we're delaying the whole process. Long term, you can't hold that back. It won't be economical anymore, but that might be 80, 100 years from now. In the meantime, I think it's a positive thing. That's my only experience of where that might happen. There probably are a lot more, but I don't know of them.
Thank you. Let's take one more. There's kind of this theme about well, what are we going to do about it? Like what kind of action? So that's why the question about the wetting the forest, and then similar question around agriculture and growing food. Like, isn't there an innovative way that we can grow food that would help mitigate these changes?
Yeah, you're talking to, unfortunately, you know what? It's the wrong fellow, because I'm an animal guy or plants at the outside, and honestly, I haven't really. I know that there is huge amount of money, right, going into at the Agriculture Canada, Forestry Canada. These people are all aware of it and working damn hard as we speak, trying to figure out what to do. Many people are active. I'm not a good person to tell you what they're doing just because it's outside of my realm of experience. In terms of wildlife and biodiversity, what I can tell you, it's kind of at the research stage. I mentioned the blazing star, the plant that we're moving to. There's a lot of these kinds of studies, a lot of uncertainty that I'm seeing. Like, we know we have to do something, but there isn't somebody out there or a department that says, I figured this out and I know what to do. That doesn't exist. A lot of people like you here are scratching their heads and thinking, yes, we've got to do something, and are still at the brainstorming, trying out different things. Some of it's more advanced. Like I said, moving the seed. Right now, there's a requirement to replant the trees that used to grow there. The seeds have to be taken locally. Well, there's a lot of movement to saying we have to shift that to a more northerly, depending on where you are, climate to stay. So it is happening today in certain areas. In other areas, just still at the head scratching, like species at risk, people don't really, I haven't seen anything. If you look at recovery plans, really isn't there. It's still a lot of work, but there's certainly what has changed in the last, let's say, 15 years is it's now being seriously being examined and treated. So people are working at it. And I mean, that's a positive step.
They're working at it, but the answer is not simple, and that's why we haven't heard about it yet.
No, this is not.
And finally, you are the guy to talk about where to find more information on ecosystem shifts in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba.
Well, that link I gave you, I think that's a good spot. I wrote the damn thing, right? Oh, yeah, it's a good starting point. It has references, that chapter 9 has references to a lot of the literature. The recent literature is that just a free digital, it's a open text, a free open text. It is updated of 2023, so the references are up to date. And you can find some of the modeling if you want that, you know, the bioclimatic, actually the real models, that's all referenced there. You know, if you're saying off the top where to go for it, I'd say that's your best starting point.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking Dr. Schneider.